Welcome again. This is George Farner with the series Another Look At. We're exploring Bible truths, helping believers grow deeper in their faith. Today's subject is two perspectives of justification. When we talk about justification, we're talking about being made right with God, what the scriptures say about being made right with God. Salvation is described a number of different ways in the New Testament. One of the more prevalent ones in Paul's writings, in the epistles, is justification. And I want to look at two different perspectives, though, because James gives one perspective, Paul gives another perspective. Sometimes people think that these are contradictory, but I want to look at these and see how they are actually complementary. First place we're going to go is Romans chapter 3, verse number 28. We read here, "For we maintain, or we conclude, that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law," or apart from the works of the law. Second one, James chapter number 2, and we're going to start in verse number 24. James says, "You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone." Now, often people have thought that this was a contradiction. And one of the things I would say that I've discovered in my own walk with the Lord and in studying scripture is that very often contradictions are primarily in our thinking or in our understanding of the verses, not in the verses themselves. And we're going to take a quick look at this and see how these two things are actually complementary, that they are not contradictory. So let's go back to the first one again. Romans chapter number 3, verse number 28. And again we read, Paul says, "Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law." Now notice what he says. He actually has a bit of a qualifier here. He says we are justified by faith without the works of the law or the deeds of the law. Now, Paul used the word law in a number of different ways in the New Testament, but one of the primary ways that he did is that he meant the Mosaic law. That is, keeping the rules and regulations, if you will, the ceremonial aspects of the law. And he said that nobody can be justified by faith through the law. He proves that conclusively throughout his writings. And in this case, he comes to the point where he says, "We therefore conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law." Well, if he says that it's without the deeds of the law, then why does James say that you're not justified by faith alone, but by works? They're talking about two very different types of works. Paul is talking about the works of the law, but James is talking about works that are produced as a result of faith. Let's look at it from this perspective. Paul is talking about being justified or made right with God. He's talking about self-sufficiency, making you right with God, and saying, no, that can't be so. In other words, his argument debars or sets aside self-reliance or good works. Nobody can say, I've been made right with God because I'm such a good person, or because I kept all the rules, because I kept the 10 commandments, or any one of a number of the other commandments for that matter. He's saying that nobody can be justified in and of themselves. In another place, Paul says, "For no flesh will glory in his sight. No flesh will boast." Ephesians 2 verse 8 says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, so that no one can boast." So he's talking about coming to a place of initial salvation. He's talking about there's no way that you can take the deeds of the law, keep them all, and tell God, you owe it to me that I be right with you. I know that's not real good English, but that's what he's referring to. Now let's go to James now. And this is chapter 2 again. We're going to start in the same spot, James chapter 2, verse number 24. James says, "You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only." Now notice he does not have the conditional works of the law. And as a matter of fact, if we were to take the time, and we don't have it here, but if you'll take the time and read chapter 2 from verses 14 to the end of chapter number 2, you'll see that he does not even mention the works of the law. He's not making a reference to law. He's looking at something a bit different. Now, what James is looking at in this case is he's talking about, and let's back up to verse number 21. He's talking about that the faith in your life should produce some form of works. James 2:21, same chapter. He says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was brought to a place of completion or full expression. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So Paul is talking about righteousness or right standing with God, coming to a place where because of my works, I cannot be made right. But now James is taking the opposite, or the complementary, and he's saying, if there is faith in your life, that faith should influence your actions. Let me put it a little bit different way. I like the Worrell translation on this one. He says, faith without corresponding action is dead. Faith without corresponding action. In other words, James is saying, wait a minute, if you say you believe it, then it should affect your behavior. Even if we look at Abraham, which it's interesting that both Paul and James use the same example. They use the same person to prove their point. Paul uses the example of Abraham, that he was justified by faith alone. But then James says, yes, and he believed God and he acted on those things. He acted like it was true. He acted on it. In other words, if you say that you have faith in Jesus Christ, you should be different. You should grow. You should bear fruit. You should have corresponding action to your faith. And it's interesting here. Let's back up again now to verse number 22. He says, you see that faith was working with his works. And as a result of the works, faith was brought to a place of completion. So you could almost say it this way, that Paul is talking about initial faith. James is talking about your faith expressing itself. And in between there, we could say that there is the process of growth. Scriptures, to use a theological term, Scripture talks about sanctification. In other words, there is growth in conformity to Jesus Christ. You come to a place of initial faith, and in your walk with the Lord, your faith should influence your behavior. It should influence your lifestyle. It should influence. You should act accordingly if you have faith. And that's really all that James is saying. James is not contradicting. He's not saying, oh, no way, forget that. We can earn our way to salvation. No, that's not what he was referring to. He was saying that your salvation should be more than just saying, oh yeah, I believe. That faith should be such in your heart that it affects your behavior. It affects the direction you go. Two things I want to look at here. In the end of verse 22, he says, as a result of the works, faith was perfected. In other words, he believed. It led to corresponding action, which caused his faith to be fully expressed. Well, how was that faith fully expressed? He acted on what the Lord told him to do. He believed that he was justified by faith. He believed that the promise of God was guaranteed to him. So in faith, he was able to offer Isaac. Now, verse 23, he says, and the scripture was fulfilled. You see, God's will in your life is not just that you know the verses, but that those verses are actually fulfilled in your life, that those verses are actually experienced in your life. Two perspectives of justification. They complement one another. They don't contradict each other. We should have both of them in our lives. Works can't get me saved, but once I get saved, then there should be works. Faith gets me saved alone. And then from there, as I act on that faith, that salvation is expressed through my life, which is God's will for your life. Thanks for joining us today. I pray that you be blessed, and even as it says in Ephesians 1, may the eyes of our understanding be enlightened, and Colossians 2, may you be established in the faith.